I gotta get a pen.
You are recording. Okay.
Hey, it says I'm recording. Yes.
Yep.
Oh, just for new people, is everybody okay with me recording you or recording me doing this? Good? Okay.
Oh, okay.
Oh, and Peter got the cat for good measure. I like
It'll last for about 8 seconds.
it.
It takes off.
We'll try it with everybody on. If it gets too rambunctious, I might mute people, but I'm going to switch over rapidly to screen share. Boom. And let me try to find my thing. All right. So like I say, if you got questions, let me know. I tried to organize this. I didn't have a ton of time to dedicate to it, so it's not fancy with photos and GIFs and other stuff, but it should work out. All right. The perennial question of what do you teach? Oh, best practices of any slideshow is never read your slides to people because it's annoying and you're assuming that they can't read. So take a second and read, and I'll talk about the important stuff. It's true.
I agree. I like somebody read.
Yeah. So had I put more time into it, I would have made like some overlapping circles or some sort of visual for this, but there's sort of three categories of stuff that you could consider teaching, or one way of dividing up everything into three things, which would be stuff that you definitely know, like you know it in your bones and it's just something that you're solid with. There's the stuff that you're working on, and there's the stuff that you don't know. For when you're teaching stuff that you know, it's, you know, on the surface, it's not always the most interesting for you to teach because you know it already, but then inevitably when you go through the process of trying to communicate what you understand, and really, I think I could go off the rails on any of these when it comes to teaching because I've sat through like hours and hours of PD and read a whole lot as a high school teacher. But in schools these days, I would say this is less true because now teachers are less a source of information and more a facilitator of like gathering information and doing that sort of stuff. So, but when you are teaching, you really have to be the source of knowledge. So when you are the source of knowledge, much of teaching is really just about communicating. So when you're teaching stuff that you know, you benefit from it because you learn and you understand it more. And then, of course, your students benefit from it because they can get more skillful and secure in whatever they know or whatever they're learning. Inevitably, everybody has areas in which they are working on stuff. I'm going to talk about zone of proximal development because it sounds fancy, but everybody has stuff that they're working on. And for those of you that have been around at the dojo for a long time, I used to spend more time noodling around with the stuff that I'm working on. One of the good things about when you're teaching things that you're still not at a totally secure stage with is that you can get more secure with it. You have to think, you're forced to think about it and consider what you're doing. And then a lot of the time when I'm doing like some of these, you know, subtle internal things that I can't really get, I'll actually see you guys, I'll see my students get it or get aspects of it before me. And then I try to be as smart as I can and instantly steal it from you and get better at it myself. So I'm no fool there, but the one caveat for when you're teaching stuff that you're working on is that you're less secure with it. So I think it's important to be upfront and say, hey, here's what I'm working on. This is what I'm going for. Give it a try. Let's try to do this together. And that's a good feeling. And I know that I've sort of eased off on doing that, but a lot of times people are asking me like, oh, show us this thing that you learned in Japan. I'm like, I didn't learn anything in Japan. I saw a bunch of stuff, but I don't have it yet. So anyway. And then just the last part, if you don't know it, don't teach it, which is to say, if you don't know it and you see it on YouTube and you think it's really cool, learn it, know it, get it. That's fine. But then it moves back into one of those other categories. So it's no longer just faking it. All right. I look at a lot of classes and a lot of the stuff that I'm trying to figure out in terms of the sort of circle of what do my students need, and then of course that changes depending on which individuals are there. So there's sort of the collective, the dojo. What does the dojo need? What does that class need that shows up at that given moment? And what does the individual that I'm talking to need? And then on the other side is sort of what do I want to do? And I think sometimes I've looked at those as being in conflict at times where it's like, oh, well, I have to do this thing, but I want to do this thing. And sometimes it's like that. But I think a good teacher does a good balance of it. I know some teachers that just do what they're interested in. And I think their students get less out of it, even if it's inspiring and interesting. And then some people just teach students the stuff that like, this is on your next Q test. And that bores me to death. So I think a good mixture. Most of the time I'd be in that middle ground of what do I want to do and what do my students need, and I can find a happy medium. Sometimes I just drift into giving people what they need, especially around Q tests. And then sometimes I just plain old show up and do what I want to do. So when you're thinking about when you might want to share something, you're probably more in the what am I interested in, but I'll say more about the different things you can sort of pull from to have something to offer. I'll do one more and then I want to stop talking because this is too much talking. Oh, we got to talk about Vygotsky. For those of you that have any sort of educational background, you've probably been through zone of proximal development. It's like it's the worst advertising for something because it sounds really nasty, but it's this really simple idea that basically everybody, like when I look at my English classroom, everybody comes in at some degree of competency in reading and writing. And then there's stuff in this sort of second area where they can sort of get it, like it's within reach, but they don't have it yet. And then there's the stuff that's plain old out of reach. So I would argue that it is irresponsible to ever teach in the green zone where you're teaching stuff that people really cannot grasp. Maybe sometimes it's inspiring. The Japanese martial arts often show you stuff that you just can't get and you won't get it for 10 years. So maybe you do go there sometimes for martial arts, but the zone of proximal development is just this concept that it's based on growth and how do you keep people growing. And that means that you have to be able to recognize where people are at, figure out what they need and give it to them. And then of course, sometimes just solidifying things that you already work on is useful as well. So this little blurb on the side, and I'll talk about this later, but like sometimes you show up to class and you've been like working on your ideas for 2 days, developing this amazing, set of things you're going to work on. And you look out and you're like, it's not going to work. And you don't do it. So that's the right thing to do. But you should be making adjustments based on what people are able to or potentially able to grasp. All right, that's the classic teacherly stuff. What questions do you have? Tired of listening to myself.
Just the first. Oh, go ahead.
No, go for it. Go for it.
I was just going to say, and I guess maybe it comes back to your first slide or something, but I would guess, I know for myself a lot of times, and, it could be this way for others, but, sometimes you think, oh, I'd like to share this, but then you run into the self-doubt thing, kind of like, do I really have something to share? Do I really know what I'm talking about? And do I feel comfortable, showing it to people? And, and so sometimes it feels easier to just zip it and not do that. But is there something that you would suggest to kind of encourage people to kind of push the boundaries a little bit? in
It's a
terms of?
great question. Yeah, I mean, when I came back from Japan, I was in my mid 20s. I for those of you that have met Takahashi Sensei, you know how incredibly little I felt like I knew what I was doing in terms of the stuff that I had been practicing for the last 3, 4, 5 years. And I was coming into a dojo where people have trained in a style that I had only studied for 1 year. And I was really out of my element. But Judy was sort of in the process of starting to pull away from the dojo, and I was desperate for more and more training just because that's what I wanted. And I'd often get to classes, and for the days that I'd teach, I'd look out at a mat full of people that were all older than me, all more worldly and wise, and I'd try to figure something worthwhile. So I can relate to self-doubt and questioning and uncertainty. And that is, I guess it's just something it never goes away. Unless you've given up and you're just boring and doing the same routine a million times over, and nobody likes that. But if you're actually growing, that means you constantly have uncertainty about what you want to share. For me, I still get like that sometimes, but when I've gone through the process of being uncertain about something and then sharing it and having people say, hey, that was good. And, I'll tell people, I'm like, I don't really have this. And they're like, no, that's cool. We want to see what you're doing. For me, that's just sort of rewarded me for continuing to explore. If you're in a position of being somebody who is less experienced, then, especially when you're looking out at a mat of people that are maybe higher ranked than you, or that they know stuff that you don't know, I would encourage you just to be confident that if it's of value to you, it's of value to the other people. I said this in the when we were talking about it on Sunday, but I was saying that, like, I've done Taino Henko a lot. I'm really interested in it. I've done it a million times, and when Charles teaches it, it's of value to me, because Charles is saying, look, here's this thing that has this big sort of metaphorical meaning to me, and it has enriched my life. And when I hear him phrase it, and I see him do it, and I see what it means to him, I can now see from a slightly different perspective, and I find that beneficial. I mean, the thing is, Jonathan, like, for me, I mean, I know Marty and some of the other educators out there can speak to this, but I find that teaching is so hard to get feedback from as an instructor, because, like, I've taught 15 years of students in schools, and I don't know what 90% of them are doing now. I don't know if I've actually had a positive impact on them. I don't know if they loved me or hated me or whatever, like, and when you teach, you run the gamut. I just started reading some of my student reviews of my classes today, and you got to remember to never do that before you actually send them off for the summer. You'll be crushed. But yeah, nothing like high schoolers for honesty. But yeah, just it never goes away. And I would just encourage you to share something of value to you. And if you find that thing of value to you, it has potential value for other people, and it is thereby worthwhile.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sensei, what about preparation? Can you talk a little bit about preparing, say, I mean, we're here in Zoom time, and, there's a special kind of preparation that has to take place. But I think that the same would be true for any class, dojo or anywhere.
Yeah. I think I get to that a little bit later on, so I'll keep cruising along, but if I forget to come back to it in the way that you're asking it, remind me, and I'll come back to that, George.
Sure.
Because that's definitely something I would assume people are thinking about if they're planning to teach. Let me keep going. New slide. I don't know. I'm going to throw some graphic sort of looking things at you just for trying to express what's going on in my head. But whenever you make a decision, I didn't want to use the politics, but there's the concept that every single act in this world has some sort of political ripple effect that like whatever you do, whether you do your 10-com with your foot here or your foot there, you're sort of creating ripples out in the world. So it's a little bit of a reason to think well, sort of maybe speaking to what George is getting at, where it's like, if you don't really think well about what you're going to teach, you just go out and do something, I guess you send out certain ripples. But like, it's teaching is a craft, and you want to be able to craft doing the things that are meaningful to you and important to you. So just recognize that I think a good instructor takes into account many different factors. And for me, coming into a dojo that was part of an organization that I wasn't all that close with. I mean, I went to literally one class with Kanai Sensei. And frankly, at the time, I barely knew who he was. I just knew I should go down to class one time. And then being in a dojo that he's his photograph is hanging on the showman, I got to sort of take into account a number of different factors. And so, I don't know. You guys don't have to deal with that, because if you're teaching a class for the rest of us, you don't have to deal with it. So let's just skip that one. Lucky you. Oh, this one's so important. Take a second to read. So I just attended Bill Gleason's online class at 5:30 today, and he actually took a fair amount of time to say, you have to constantly ask yourself, one of the things I didn't write here, which is, why am I training? And, I think that question becomes more and more central, more and more upfront the longer you train. In the beginning, you don't really have to answer that question all that much. Hopefully, you go to the dojo, you learn some techniques, you have some fun, you meet some nice people, and you want to keep doing it. When you look at yourself after 10 years, after 15 years, after 20 years, or whatever, you're spending time away from your family. It's costing you more and more money. You get less and less sleep. You have to really ask yourself, why the hell am I doing this? And I don't think you ever come to a satisfactory answer, because it never stays still. You're always moving. But that's why it's such a great point of reflection, where if you can figure out why you're training and why you're doing what you're doing, it's much easier to access that stuff about, what do I want to share, what's worthwhile, and what am I doing here? So I was a little more practical for what I wrote down here, but definitely take some time to reflect and think, specifically when you're coming up with teaching something, think to yourself, what do I want to do? And in a general sense, like, what do I want my Aikido to be? And then, as you're training, take a hard look at yourself and ask yourself if you're really doing it. It would be a worthwhile activity for any of you to answer the question, why do I train? And what do I want my Aikido to be? Just force yourself to put something down on paper. Don't think about it too much. And then go train. And then really look at what you're doing. Like, are you using your opponent's energy against him? Are you, being that neutral, stable center that receives and redirects? Are you just plain old pushing people over and bullying them across the mat? Like, anyway, it really comes down to trying to bring your practice in line with your ideals. And I've referred to this out before. I don't know all of the other meanings of the pleats. I could probably find a website pretty quickly, but the first pleat in your hakama is makoto, which means something like sincerity, honesty, or truth. And if you're not honest with yourself about what you're doing, you never go any further. Like, you're done. Like, you can keep doing it forever. But if you say, I'm doing it, sensei did, I'm using internal power and I'm peaceful and blah, 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 that's as far as you ever go, because nobody's ever doing that all the time. And if you can't see the times that your practice falls out of line with your ideals, then it's really hard to make any progress. So that's why the honesty thing is so important.
Sensei, can I ask a question?
Yeah, please. Good. Interrupt me, please.
The on this here, what about like criticism, asking for criticism, let's say, rather than have unsolicited criticism, which would be different, I think.
Yeah.
But or using videos or other tools.
Sure. I mean, these days there's so much stuff available. I mean, I think the eyes of a skilled instructor or a skilled senpai that you trust can do whatever thing you're trying to learn. That's going to be your best feedback, because they're going to be able to guide you towards something. No guarantee that they're necessarily the best teacher or communicator, but if they can do what you want to do, take a look at what they're doing and try to learn from it. But video yourself. That's a, like I know, like Yuka and I have often talked about how when you're doing calligraphy, when you do Aikido, you do like 4 throws, you switch roles, you do 4 throws, you switch roles, and you go home and you're like, I feel really good. Like, do calligraphy. I'm going to write the number 1, which is just a straight line. Oh, that didn't go so well. Let me do it again. Oh, yeah, that one's pretty nasty. Oh, yeah, totally lost. Like, you're actually forced to look at it. So that's what video and photography could do for you, in a sense, George. So I think it's a great tool. I don't know if you were around when we did it, but I actually forced everybody to do Shomen cuts and Yokomen cuts in front of a camera. And then I uploaded them to YouTube privately and then shared them with people. And like, man, that was not easy. Like having to stare at yourself as you do those things, and you can't go back and adjust them and do the things you're supposed to do. It's a little painful, but that's that honesty thing. So if filming it helps you get there, by all means, go for it. Just general ways to do this. I keep a journal. I have 2 main reasons why I keep a journal. The first one is that when I go to a seminar, I've gone to a lot of seminars. I used to go to them a little bit more recreationally, where like I'd go, I'd train, I'd feel good, I'd meet some cool people and maybe see some things that looked interesting, and then I'd leave. And now I'm more intentional. Some seminars I still am just doing that, but sometimes if the teacher's sharing something I'm really interested in, I know that if I take time to process what they taught and commit it to words and try to think of how I'd articulate it, and then draw some really crappy stick figure drawings to try to express some complicated thing I don't understand, it sticks to you. And then you can actually recreate that, and eventually you own that. So, and also the other part of a journal is just that, like, if you have a bunch of thoughts floating around in your head, it makes you crazy. And if you write them down, you feel a little less crazy. So keep a journal. It's a good thing. Talk to people about your practice when you verbalize things, especially with people that are good listeners or invested in what you're doing. That can really help you clarify what you're doing. And then read, research, learn about people who inspire you, and then, let that lead you to what you're doing. Let that remind you what you're interested in and why you're here and all that other stuff I talked about before.
Aaron, do you find that journaling helps you recall the techniques you were practicing? I think that's a great idea.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I find that's what I lose when I go to a seminar, is I get so awash. And after a day or 2, I probably couldn't tell you what I did in the seminar.
That's the way it is. You can, like Zach, for example, when you used to see like Kato sensei on a regular basis or something like that. Well, for him, since you'd only see him once a year, I'd write down everything. But if you're training at a regular class and it's sort of something that you're going to see more of, writing stuff down, you go back and you revisit it mentally. And this online training that we've been doing, it's the same part of your brain that I ask you, like, okay, everybody, you're going to take ukemi from somebody who's doing shomenuchi, or you're doing shomenuchi and they're doing ikkyo to you. And you then have to use only your brain to try to visualize this thing and move your body in accordance with that. And that is a really difficult skill. But once your brain knows it in a sort of visual spatial sort of way, and then journaling, you're taking that visual spatial part of your brain and then you're turning it into the linguistic part of your brain, and then you're putting it somewhere else. Every time you make a connection across your brain, it solidifies and goes deeper, and now it's closer to being yours. So Zach, for me, like when I go train with Bill Gleason, like it's just an overwhelmingly huge amount of awesome information. So for me, I pick and choose a couple of things that I sort of got or sort of were, really found inspiring, and I write those down. and I let go of the rest of it because I can't keep it. And I hope the rest of it comes back sometime.
Sensei, how do you feel about, I mean, how do you get people to use that third eye that you're talking about? You know, that ability to visualize where they are in space, especially in COVID time.
You just practice it. I mean, you know,
I mean, but
you,
can you like find a way, is there something that you can do to get people to use that? I mean, because that's,
yeah. So I mean,
unique.
like, you know, like I've gone back to this, like I can see it in one of my journals, when I was getting ready for my Sandan test, and I'd come back from Japan, you know, I had gotten my black belt in California, and then I was training under David Halpern for my Sandan test, for my, you know, this big test. It's like, at that point, that was like the final black belt test you take. And I know that David Halpern has no love for anything fluffy and West Coasty, and he's total Kanai student and totally has these high expectations for technical proficiency. I'm like, oh crap, I got to get this good. And so to do that, of course I trained with people, and of course I took whatever input he gave me. But most of my training for that test was that I wrote down a list of approximately 10 techniques I could think of from a given attack. I'd read them over until I knew them pretty well. And then I'd wake up in the mornings at 5 a.m. and at the end of my bed, I'd solo go through doing those techniques, and I'd do one after another and try to pattern it into my body. And then when you're sitting there with, you know, 3 Shihan staring at you and 50 people in a room, you know, wondering who this guy is taking a Sandan test, it's really nice to have those patterns in your brain because they just show up in your body. So anything that you go through those movements, which is all the stuff we've been doing in the Zoom training, like that's all we can do. So it's awesome. It's not as satisfying, but it's awesome.
So this thing you're talking about actually physically performing the technique at the end of your bed, as you said.
I'm talking about,
Or visualizing. Are you talking about going through it in your mind?
no, in your mind is a starting point. Like if you can't see something in your head, you can't do it with your body, or at least not very well. But physically seeing something in your head and then performing that movement, that's how you make something your own. That's how you pattern your body and your nervous system to integrate things. So it's like I say, I mean, it's sort of like we're all training to get ready to actually train, you know, we're like preparing for something, but that preparation is so valuable. And if you keep flexing those imagination muscles in your head, you'll be amazing. I'm going to keep going.
Yeah.
So the second section, the first part is really focused on content, and I could go further into that if you want, but how do you help people learn? I think this is probably less applicable when you're having more horizontal training, when you're going to be at the same level as the other people, or you're maybe even co-high to them. How do you help people learn? I just thought I'd throw it in here because it's such a big part of, you know, what makes me feel like a competent teacher. So I'll go into this a little bit. Yeah, take a second and read. So hold on one second. Okay. So when you like, you just got to zoom out sometimes, no pun intended. And when you're trying to figure out what you want to teach, starting with the big picture, some of the ways you can do that would be looking at like, well, what's the USAF guidelines for tests? Or what do I want my students' experience to be on the mat? You know, especially as a dojo cho, that one's should be at the front of your mind. What kind of a community do I want to create? Where do I want to be? What's a place that I'd want to go to on a daily basis? How is our practice relevant to today? You know, especially for Aikido, where like, yeah, swords, that's real relevant. Trying to figure out how that's going to tie into people's lives and offer them something of value in a day where, you know, conflicts are sort of usually solved with things that look more like guns than anything else. But you know, what does this art have to offer people in their daily lives? Because most people, it's sort of a hobby. It's just something in the background, but it still should be of value. If you recognize what's important for you, that's a good starting place. Going back to the idea that if it's valuable to you, that it's probably valuable to other people. And I think one thing that sort of back to Jonathan's point, that I used to underestimate and now I see the value in, which is trying to recognize what you have to offer other people. Self-doubt, it's a part of everything. Like that's, you know, and we all have it in varying degrees, but being able to recognize that you actually have something and that you can share it with other people, and that other people will appreciate it and benefit from it. If you sit around wondering like, oh, do I have something good, or are they going to like me, or but like, you just lose this great opportunity to share. And sometimes you just got to jump into the pool and sink or swim, just do it. And it ain't going to be perfect every time, but if you don't do anything, you get nothing. So everybody's got something to offer. I believe that. Take a second to read this. These aren't like anything I've been taught at some professional development day or anything. This is just what I tend to do when I'm on the mat. If I teach a technique and then I'm going around, this is basically the sort of, you know, these are the processes going on in my head, which is that I know what I taught, I know what I wanted people to do. Like you have to be able to do that. But then take a really close look at what people are doing. I guess one thing I should say is that sometimes you look around and most people aren't doing what you showed, and you make a hard decision about what to do with that. You know, sometimes I look around the mat and I know like, oh, she's going to listen. And I go talk to somebody and I say, here's what you're doing and here's what I'd like you to do. Sometimes I look around and I'm like, you just keep doing what you're doing, you know, because, you know, or, you know, I'll try to show them something and it's like, if they don't want to learn, that's fine. I'll leave it up to you. If you're having fun, keep doing it. So not every teacher's like that. Some teachers are much more prescriptive, where they're going to tell you what to do and how to do it. And if you don't do it that way, they're going to tell you again. There is value in that because they can help steer you towards something. If, you know, if they really are good and have something worthwhile that can help you as a student get there. It also can be not very fun at times. So it's one of those things you got to make a decision about. When you look at what somebody's doing, I think this is actually really valuable for martial arts and for just people in general. But like, when you train your eyes to be able to look at somebody and you know what they're actually thinking in their head, possibly more than they do, in terms of how they're guiding their bodies, you can jump in and say, hey, you know, this concept that you have, that's cool, and here's this other way of looking at it. And when you can find the right words and the right way to convey it, you can really see what's going on in their heads. And, you know, maybe a misunderstanding is one way to put it, or just they're understanding it differently. You can, if you can really empathize and really see what they're doing, you're able to guide them towards something that's, you know, going to actually allow them to get past whatever that hurdle is. And a lot of the times that hurdle is conceptual. Words in Japan, they don't talk a lot, and it probably saves a lot of time, where people get this cool idea in their mind about ki or extension or power and then totally do stupid things. But that's the way we tend to teach in the West, where we're pretty verbal, but it's a double-edged sword. There you go. I think one thing that's really useful is when you look at what people are doing, if you can identify patterns, especially when you know students for a long time. So like, I know my students, I know everybody, I know who's got tight shoulders, I know who sticks their butt out, I know who, you know, is going to, you know, lean forward in a certain way. And, you know, it can be annoying. Sometimes you don't want to hear that your shoulders are tight every time you see Bill Gleason. But, you also sometimes need to hear those things so you don't delude yourself and whatever. And hopefully you trust the person giving you that feedback. But if you can connect it to some broader pattern, I think that's more valuable to people in their training, because then they can see like, oh, you know, I have this tendency, and if I can address it in Tenchi Nage, then I can then use that little access point and open up a whole bunch of other places. And once you open up one of those doors, they tend to just open themselves up afterwards.
I like too that patterns, building on patterns. I find when I have taught classes that build incrementally pieces or put them together, how one technique or concept and different techniques flows together,
Yeah.
that really puts a cohesion in the class as a whole that I like, and I think the people in the classes also like. So
Yeah.
I'd love to hear what other people's take it on is on that, as experiencing classes that way.
Yeah, and to that point, if you have to develop a whole class, you know, right now I'm asking people to jump in for 15 minutes at a time or something like that, and that's pretty good for doing a one-off, and there's no need to coordinate that with the other people teaching that day. But when you're developing a whole class, often some of the classes that I enjoy the most, and I think students enjoy and learn the most from, are where you start out with a concept, and then instead of saying like, I'll do like these 4 techniques, you say, okay, I have this concept of, you know, a plumb line running through my body, and I'm going to move from my center, and I have to maintain that plumb line. Well, like, what's a really challenging technique to like try to maintain that verticality? Oh, like everybody loves to lead with their head and shoulders on ikkyo. So like, let's work on that. Oh, and I'll make them stand on one foot, because then you can't lean because you don't have another foot. And what I'm getting at isn't that you need to do the things that I necessarily do, or whatever you do, what you do. But when you find a concept, and that's why I say it really comes down to communication, you try to think, how do I get somebody else to experience this or learn from this? And that's a great way of organizing something and structuring it. Should I be reading comments? I can't read every. If there's comments I need to hear about, let me know. If it's banter, I'll let it go. Let me do.
It's all good.
It's all good. You be my monitor, Sophie. Let me know. Let me do 2 more slides on feedback, and then after that, I will answer more questions so I don't have to talk at you so much. So I'm really concerned about feedback. When I was in grad school, that's one of the things that I researched a lot. As a teacher, you know, it's sort of when you're in coaching mode, you know, teaching in schools used to be more of like a stand and deliver, where you try to get really good at your shtick and you get up there and know a lot and present it. Now, a lot of the time, especially as an English teacher, a lot of it's about coaching people to apply skills in more and more complex situations and do higher and higher, you know, evolved jobs of what they're doing. But feedback's key. So one thing to know, you've actually probably heard me say it. There's this concept of a cognitive task. This is why you do not text and drive, because when you're writing, when you're using the verbal part of your brain, and specifically when you're looking at a device while you're doing it, you cannot process something else. Driving itself isn't really a cognitive task until something goes wrong. But when you're using your brain for one thing that you have to think about, your brain can't think well about another thing, which is why we like try to get our kids off of devices when they're doing their homework, because it's like whatever you're producing is a lower quality because you're switching tasks and losing quality on whatever you're doing. So how does that apply to teaching and teaching martial arts? Don't overwhelm people. You have to be really, really, you have to show restraint. If you know what you're doing, like you're the teacher, you just showed something, of course you know it. And then you see somebody do like 4 things wrong. If you tell them 4 things that they're doing wrong, they will gain nothing. They will feel bad about themselves and they will gain very little. You need to be able to look at that student, know that student, and say, the next thing you could do to make this better is this. Explain it to them, be really clear about it, show it to them, make sure they got it, and then move on from there. So don't overwhelm people. Give them one thing to think about at a time, or they will get nothing. Also, look at what are the results of whatever you've done. I think this sort of goes back to the ambiguity and inaccuracy of words, right? Words are these symbols that are meant to convey something, and If I say tree and you think about a tree and I think about a tree, we're seeing different things, even though I'm saying tree and it's this common thing. So when you say something to a student or when you show it, again, go back to like trying to figure out what are they hearing, what are they thinking, and then sometimes you just have to let go of the words that you're using and help them understand it in a way that works. You know, I'm a pragmatist. If I say it, I tend to say things in different ways. And sometimes people think like, oh, he's being inconsistent. Usually when I'm saying this, you know, something in a different way, it's because I know that some people it's going to click with them and other people it won't. So if I give them a bunch of different ways to say it and I'm still showing you the same thing, one of those might work. So always when you give feedback, watch your students and see what do they do in response to it, and use that as a metric for how you make adjustments in terms of giving more feedback or instruction. One more and then I'm going to stop for a little bit. So the last one was about figuring out what feedback to give. How do you give it? I would encourage you, and this is where your senpai kohai or your sensei sort of status might affect what you're doing sort of inevitably, but the best feedback is going to be very specific, very direct, and non-judgmental. You know, you don't go over and be like, oh, you know, Johnny, I really see that you want to do a good job of this and you're really trying hard and I like that. I'm so proud. You're like, no, you know, when I did this, I did a super tenkan instead of a tenkan. If you just do a tenkan and you turn, your hips are going to end up in a funny line and you're going to lose your lateral stability. You need to put your foot here, and then you show them that, and then you try to get them to do it. So that's hard to do because, you know, it feels, not everybody likes to be assertive in that way. I know that that wasn't my initial tendency as a teacher, especially not on the mat, but sometimes you just have to be clear, and that really is the best thing to do for people to be able to learn and not have a whole bunch of chaos in their head. Even my high school students I've been called on doing this for kids that have learned about it in the past, but this is a really good way to get anybody to like feel like they can take part in learning something, which is the feedback sandwich. You go up to somebody and you be like, cool, you're moving from your center really well. And then you go to the next one. You could improve by, you know, not raising your shoulders when you make that turn. Instead, drop your shoulders down and relax. Okay, there's the one way they could improve, and then you demonstrate it. And so you can actually physically show them that. So it's praise, but it's targeted praise. You let them know, like, it's going back to that Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. This is what you're capable of, and this is what you're already doing independently, and that is cool. You have a foundation. If you don't let people know what that is, then they don't know what they're good at, and they, you know, don't have something to build off of. You show them the next step, you tell them the next step, and then you show them the next step. So that can be a really good way to give feedback. Woo! What do I have left? Oh yeah, I think it's mostly sort of miscellany after this. So this is a great time to ask some questions. I just threw a whole lot of stuff at you and would rather hear your voice than mine for a little bit. Who's got questions?
I have a question.
Please.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so you showed a slide where you have the overlapping student interests with the instructor's interests.
Yep.
How is that different for you in teaching English to high school students from teaching, I want to say, probably highly motivated martial arts students?
Right. It's a different gig, but I think it has some similarities. Like at the dojo, you know, this is what we're all, we've all, you know, we're spending our free time training. We're spending our disposable income training. We're giving up other things to be there, and we are highly motivated. For my students at school, when you know, you all but have to force them to get to school and sit in a chair and go through all the crap you're going to drag them through. I think for me, I try to find what's interesting about what I'm doing, but more honestly, I think the thing that rewards me is is when you're able to take a kid who is here and you help them go there. And that's just, you know, that's like my scant experiences with golf, which is that I'm absolutely terrible at, which is that you try to hit the ball and it doesn't go well most of the time. And then you hit it well once and it's like, oh, that was amazing. And, you know, getting a kid to be able to identify a run-on sentence and then correct that bad habit in their writing. And you know that like the rest of their lives, they don't have to write run-on sentences. It's very rewarding. And, you know, when you, at least for me, like I find that when I can find ways to teach that facilitate that and lead to more consistent, better outcomes, that's what sort of drives me. Paycheck, healthcare, I don't know. It all sort of drives me, but mix them all in there and you got it.
Yeah.
Could you speak a little bit to how you create the arc of the curriculum over several classes to a year in the dojo's life with all the mixes you get?
You make it sound like it's something that's intentional. Maybe it should be. No, Colin, that's a really tough question. Things get more and more meta as you teach and like run a dojo. So like most of it for me is that I like, you know, like I'll just try to think of a concrete experience. So like, you know, I'll go to a seminar in Brattleboro with Mary Heine, and everybody there's like loosey goosey and they're like feeling stuff, and you know, there's things that I'm interested in, things that I'm not too concerned about. But I look at all of them and I say, wow, they have this quality of being able to be really easy and move well, and they're not trying to grind each other into the mat. And then I come back to our dojo, I'm like, there's a number of people who are trying to grind each other in the mat, whether that's what they intend to do or not. And so I think, how do I help them access those things that I saw somewhere else or that I think are important? And then my response would be like, we're just going to work on ukemi. We're going to follow people around, and we're going to, like, you know how I have you sometimes grab where you don't hold on to their wrist, you put your hand there and you have to try to maintain that connection. Well, guess what, strong guys? I don't care. If you don't grab them, you can't stay connected without moving your body in a fluid way. So you're going to have to learn how to move. And so I, you know, that same concept of the, you know, how do you help somebody move forward, is that I try to look at the whole dojo, which is so hard to do because it never holds still. You know, I might have this great concept and then like 8 people show up that they're already totally fluent at taking ukemi and being soft. And I'm like, well, I guess I don't need to teach that. But that's one of the toughest things, is trying to figure out how you guide people towards stuff. You know, obviously I'm bound to the USAF curriculum for teaching techniques, so that defines a lot of the technical bits. But really, I sort of come back to what do I want my Aikido to be, and how do I get that to come out in my students, and circle back on that as best as I can. The thing that gets really, really meta is trying to figure out how you cultivate students that are really good students. You know, like I look at, like, you know, like Claude Bertium, and I see the students that he brings up that he's been teaching for like 35 years, and I see how attuned they are to what he's doing, and their etiquette and their attentiveness. And it's like, how do you make that happen? You know, do you yell at people until they do it? Do you praise them and make them feel good until they do it? Do you keep increasing your dues until they feel like they have to just do it on their own? Like, you know, it's tough to figure out. And that's one of the biggest challenges that, and especially with me having bounced around to a bunch of different dojos, I don't have like the concept of how it's done. I don't have a fallback for that. So my ass is always sort of in the wind on that one, and I'm faking it as I go. But as long as I'm paying attention to what I see on the mat, and I feel good about what people are doing and they're benefiting from it, that feels like enough for me at this point.
How do you deal with, or what's your philosophy with a differentiated group where you have, It's something I always struggle with. I'm curious if you have a just, hey, I'll deal with what's in front of me, or I have a philosophy, lowest common denominator.
Are you talking about English classroom or Aikido classroom?
No, the Aikido mat where you have,
Yeah. So for those of you that aren't in education, differentiation is the concept that you have, like in an English class, it's probably easier to explain. I have kids in my 11th grade junior English class that are reading at a mid-college level because they're smart and they can read and they're literate. And I have kids that are reading at a 6th grade level, and we're going to read The Great Gatsby. So what Doug's sort of saying is like sometimes, you go into class and you have this concept of like, I really want to work on this stuff, and you get there and you look at the mat and there's like two newbies, two black belts hanging out in the back, talking to each other, and then you got, a bunch of eager, white belts coming up on, first and second Q tests. Like, what do you do? I think the most basic thing, like the sort of go-to for that for me is that, as I'll say in a second, usually I start classes with something that's I try to think of things that are familiar, which is why the beginnings of classes are sort of warm-uppy and repetitive, and you want people to feel comfortable in their bodies. And it takes a while for us to transition out of our like laundry list, being stuck at work sort of modes, and then being on the mat. So doing some of those repetitive things can ground them and make them feel like, okay, I'm ready to do this. And then you start layering in a little bit more challenge and a little bit more complexity. You don't always have to, but if you're going to do something really challenging, do that towards the end. And then Doug, to like a really basic way is that, let's say I'm working on variations. I'll show 4 different techniques and I'll tell people, okay, we got 4 variations from attacks from ski. If you only know Kotegaeshi, just do Kotegaeshi 4 times. If you know the other ones, do them. And if you're somewhere in between, do what you can. And then that gives everybody a chance to do something meaningful. It leaves people so they don't feel left out.
I see.
Yeah, differentiation is a challenge. And sometimes, Doug, I just look out at the mat and I go, yep, we're not ready. Cancel that. I'll do it on Thursday,
Right.
Let me show my last slide so I can get done with the stuff I wanted to talk about. And then I can't remember if I have 1 slide or 2. And then if people have more questions, we'll do that, and then we'll wrap up. Yeah, I think this is my last slide. So this is the sort of catch-all of stuff that I wanted to talk about, but didn't know how to fit them into something else. When you're teaching, when we get back in the dojo, safety first, like just deal with it. But if you're teaching something like Koshinage, know what's in jeopardy. Know that people could break their necks. If you're teaching Kotegaeshi, know that if somebody doesn't know how to take the ukemi, their wrist is in jeopardy. Know that Shihonage, when you're nervous and doing it quickly in Randori, can tear people's arms off. So you do have to have, if you're up there teaching a class, you better think ahead to what are the potential issues here and recognize them. And you don't get there in the beginning. You got to know the techniques pretty well. But, like when I'm teaching little kids how to do back rolls, I literally make them say back to me, I'm like, okay, when you're doing a back roll, what's the one part of your body I want to make sure you don't hurt? And they all point to their necks. And when we're going to do back falls, they say, what does everybody do when you're going to do back fall? What do we need to be careful of? And they say, don't bonk your head. I don't make the adults do it, but it's in the back of my mind. When you teach, follow a routine. I used to be more sort of freestyle-y and just show up and kind of do something a little bit more. And it's a little bit fun until you look around and people don't get it, and they maybe feel frustrated, and it becomes more about you when you do stuff that's too frilly or whatever. So you have to strike a balance, and everybody has a different balance for that. So if you're out there running your own dojo, you need to know, I need to grind in those cue techniques and get them perfect, or you need to know, I need everybody to have a soft feeling in their body, period. You got to figure out what that is and focus on that. But routine helps you get there. As I said when I was talking in response to Doug's question about differentiation, start with familiar things and then work your way to more difficult, complex, confusing stuff. And then if at any point you go too far off the rails and people are no longer putting the pieces together, go back a step or just stop moving forward, or look around and go, wow, everybody looks like they're going to pass out. Let's do Kokyo for a while. So you just be responsive. Many a time I've had a glorious plan in mind and shown up to the dojo and bowed in and looked at the mat and said, yep, I'm going to do that on Thursday. And you know what? As you teach more and more, you get more and more in your back pocket. So for me, I have no fear of that because I've got 50 other things I could probably come up with. Some of my favorite classes have been ones that I'm just riffing on something or BSing because I didn't know what I was going to do because I was too busy. So have a plan, but be ready to abandon or change that plan. And in the beginning, when you don't have that much in your back pocket, that's much harder to do. But if you're up there teaching a class, that means somebody believed in you enough to have you go up there. Fake it. If you're sharing from the heart, you're going to give them something that'll work out just fine. And then this last part is actually really, like, this is sort of how I tend to do showing any one discrete skill or technique. Whole part whole. Super simple. Don't talk to them at first. When you get up there in front of the class, do not tell them what you're about to do. Don't tell them what you're doing while you do it. Don't stop in the middle and talk to them about it. Show them, because in martial arts, you must be training your eyes. In Japanese, they say mite nusumu, which literally means see it and steal it. So fundamental to our practice is that you develop your eyes and you look at it. At Hombu Dojo, most of the time for Doshu's classes, he just gets up and he shows a technique 4 times and then says, go. So you have to have that. Show the full technique or show the full thing that you're going to show. From there, talk about the one part that you think is valuable that you want them to focus on. And this goes back to having some concept of like, oh, I want to have everybody work on their center line and moving from center instead of losing that axis. Explain how in Tenchinage you are using that vertical axis and taking their balance via that. And then loop back and show them the whole thing again, so that now that you've told them this is what I'm doing, they can now train their own eyes and see it happening in that whole pattern. So if you just get up there and do the whole thing, which is more the sort of traditional / Japanese way to do it, then those people are constantly trying to think, how do I break this down and make sense of it? Here in America, we tend to do more of that analysis verbally and explicitly, for better or for worse. But when you're going to do that is between the sandwich of show them the whole thing, explain the part you want to focus on, and then come back to the whole thing. If you're missing any of those components, people tend to go off and do even more random, disparate things. Ah, look at that, just like I timed it. Let me stop staring at this and look at more of you. What else do you want to know? Let me go back. Jonathan, you had sort of initially asked for this. Did that do anything like what you were hoping for?
It was awesome and continues to be. Yeah, I mean, yeah, because I've had a lot of thoughts in terms of like whether it's, you know, and somebody else is going to be there, somebody's running late, and suddenly somebody or ends up having to teach spontaneously, or was just even thinking with the even these little 15-minute segments, it's in Zoom brings its own thing as well. But I think we have a lot of people that have, as you suggested, Aaron, something to share, but sometimes we may not all feel confident in our own ability to do that. I did have one question though, on the in the whole when you were saying, I just wrote a note for myself: show, don't tell. At least in the first part, as far as demonstrating. But I guess
it's show, tell, and show again.
Show, tell, show again.
No, I mean that really is what that means. Is that you show them the whole thing, but most people can't necessarily break that down on the spot. So then you tell them what you're doing so that you're then using that verbal part of the brain and pointing out specifically what you want them to do. And then you show them again so they can now integrate those things. It's a process of integrating complex stuff.
Cool. Yeah, so just if you're sharing something that you're working on, I would guess you have to probably at least mention why, or I don't know, would you just, again, just demonstrate it and then explain why you're showing it, or?
The best way I'd say is that you're just trying to, you tell them what you're trying to do. So like when I show, you know, especially when I go down and see like Bill Gleason, or if I'm working on something Yoshi showed me, I'll tell people like, look, you know, Bill Gleason said that when they come in for showmen, there's rotation, and that rotation should float them. And then when you open your arm, you're coming over the top, and that should take them down without applying pressure. And I can't do it. So I'll tell people, here's what he said, here's what I'm trying to do, and this is what it would look like. And it would either work or it wouldn't. And I'd let people know this is what I'm trying to do. And that's what I really had a consistent experience of, like, at least somebody in the class is actually going to get the thing quicker than me. And I'll go, ooh, what do they do? And I want to try to figure it out. And then I'll be like, hey, everybody, stop and watch this person. So yeah, when you're sharing something that you're not super confident about, let people know what your goal is, and then they can all work towards that. I've always liked the analogy of like, you know, when you talk about like techniques in Aikido and like, should we just teach techniques all the time? You know, it's like when you're trying to show your dog the moon, you point off to the moon, you're like, hey dog, look at the moon, it's gorgeous. What does the dog look at? Your finger, right? So that's sort of what technique is to me, where it's like, hey, everybody, look at these techniques. We've got 50 names for techniques. Aren't they amazing? And it's like, oh, Sensei was pointing at something. We're all looking at his finger here. Like, don't be confused. Anyway, I digress.
It's a good example. I like that analogy.
Yeah.
I have 3.5 questions.
Wow. You're on.
That's a lot. I feel like that's okay. So conceptually, do you find it harder to go from 0 to something than going from some level of skill to a bigger level of skill? Or do you just kind of feel like everybody starts somewhere?
I don't know what you mean. Can you explain it with some concrete example?
Yeah, like I find in French class, it's easier to take French kids from level 1 to level 2 than it is to take French kids from level 0 to level 1.
Yeah.
Is it similar in, I mean, I think it is, because when people already have a concept of something, it's easier to expand on than when they're, I forget what the diagram there that you showed, the 3 concentric circles.
Mm.
If they don't have any circle, how do you get them into that, in other words?
Scaffolding?
Scaffolding, yeah. I mean, Sophie, what I'd say is that when you're teaching, like let's say you're taking somebody from a level 1 Aikido to a level 2 Aikido, they're going to move from having this much knowledge to having this much knowledge, which is going to be twice as much knowledge. When you're teaching somebody who's been training for 10 years, they're going to have this much knowledge, and if they go to this much knowledge, it's like a 1% gain, but that's still really valuable. I think the other way, like that, the mathematics of it don't quite work that way, because every time I learn one new thing, I can then plug and play into 50 other techniques that I already know. And so like that 0.1% gain that I get is like amazing, because everything unlocks. But like when you see that massive leap that a newbie takes, that can be really rewarding and helpful. I think the further up the scale you go, the more nuanced and subtle your teaching and your training has to be. How do you take somebody from 0 to nothing? You decide what's important, you figure out how to get them there. And, you know, like with a beginner's course, I had to try to define what I wanted people to get out of it. And I come back to it and I say, I want to give you a concept of Aikido so that whether you stick around or not, it can go with you the rest of your life. And I want you to have exposure to some techniques and some basic, skills, falling, stuff like that. If I can do that, I'm happy. And if you try to do more than that, you'll make yourself miserable. So you need to be able to decide what's valuable and what you're willing to let go or put on hold for now.
I like it. Do you think that martial arts are self-selecting for people who have a kind of like, you were talking about like the good students that Claude Bertillon brings and how they have courtesy and attentiveness and how they have tenacity, like they keep coming back to practice hard things. Do you think martial arts is self-selecting for that? Or is any subject really self-selecting for people with determination?
Oh, that's a good question. There's certainly people that walk into the dojo and I know they'll never come back, and that's probably the right thing for all of us. Not that for anybody who's got to take off, do what you got to do. See you, Charles. There's people that come into the dojo and, it's oftentimes the people that have said to me, oh, I saw an Aikido demonstration when I was in college, and that was 30 years ago. And here I am, and I'm going to finally do this thing that I've been excited about. And then they try to do 3 back falls, and they're like, yeah, my knees won't do it. And they just leave. Or somebody that's like, I've been developing my concept of Aikido, doing blah, blah, blah for whatever. And then they show up and they're like, oh, you're just a bunch of sweaty guys like falling around on the ground. This isn't fun. And I wouldn't call it self-selecting. I think, Sophie, the thing that's more pertinent to me as an instructor is that I look at students of teachers and you see that some teachers can consistently bring about certain traits. Nobody gets all of them, but some people bring out the best traits in their students, and I want to figure out how to do that. And in the same right, sometimes you have students that have either a total hodgepodge or like not even great teachers, and they can do amazing things. And that student just has some unique ability. And it's all in the mix. So, in some ways you do judge a teacher by his or her students, and in some ways, sometimes you just give them credit where credit's due and let your students do the work and let them be awesome. So I don't know. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
Yeah. I think it's really different in a dojo than in public school. Like, we don't get to select our students or encourage specific I don't know if your school does, but my school has homogeneous classrooms, so we can't level the students at all or anything like that. So, and I think motivation is really, I try to bring our motivated attitude from the dojo into the classroom, my French classrooms, and it is very hard to do.
Yeah, and I think you're already doing an awesome job where you had all your kids, like you said, you had that one student that like you did the Shinkoku breathing and she like broke into tears because she's like, oh my God, I've missed this so much. Sweet. Like, I hear that and I'm like, man, I got to really up my game in the classroom because I'm not doing that. So I think the thing that makes me feel sane as a teacher going back year after year is that you build a connection with them and you try to figure out where they're at and you try to offer them something that can be of value to them. Sometimes it takes more cajoling than for others. At a dojo where everybody's basically there because they want to get something or they choose to be there, then it's a little bit of a different gig. But if you should, I mean, actually this is really relevant where like when you look at Aikido, we talk about this at board meetings. You guys can use devices if you want. When you look at Aikido today, it's in a stated decline. The number of people training in Aikido is less and less each year. The number of people doing martial arts is less and less each year, even though like MMA is pretty big. It's on the decline, which to me suggests that people are not finding value in it, that there isn't something.
It's a worldwide thing?
It's worldwide. It's in America. I'm still jealous of France because they seem to still have an awesome amount of people training. But basically, like I know that there was a poll recently of Aikido dojos in the US, and the average number of students was like 3 to 4 for the dojo.
Whoa.
Yeah, like, you know, we're staring into the abyss. And
Oh, wait. Like farmers markets feel similarly because they have declining attendance. But really what has happened is that like every town has its own farmers market. So of course you have fewer people because they don't travel as far to go. Is it similar with dojos?
it's a good question. I don't know who's been gathering or analyzing the data, but whatever it is, I mean, I talked to Leo Tamaki about this, and you know, he's like, you know, I'm like, yeah, well, you know, my opinion is, well, if we have fewer people doing Aikido, that just means that the real hardcore people that really want to get it are going to stick around, and well, maybe it's just going to get better that way. And he's like, yeah, well, that's how I make my living. And, you know, I want people to do Aikido. I think it's great. And I agree with that too. So I don't know, Sophie, to your point about whether it's because there's more dojos and the numerators and denominators are fudging the data. I don't know, but I think it's clear, you know, I mean, studios used to get students because Steven Seagal broke people's arms in movies, and they were like, oh, that's cool. What does he do? What's it called? Aikido? Let's go do that. And they'd go to the dojo. We don't have a lot of martial arts heroes now. You know, we have superheroes. If you can teach people how to have superpowers, you'd get rich and have a huge following. But like, I don't know. So anyway, what I was coming back to is that as an instructor of a dojo, how do you figure out what is of value to people is really tough. You know, how do I get a bunch of people to give up their free time and their time with their families and their spare income to come roll around on a mat or try to punch each other in the head? Like, what's the point?
Especially when there's guns.
Especially when there's guns, because, you know, anybody in the street, oh yeah, well, I could fix anything, or I could solve anything with a gun. It's like, you know what? I can't beat your gun. You're right. You know, I could probably be a more empathetic and whatever human being, but, you know, maybe that's not a value to him.
I don't know. I think Aikido is valuable because of that, actually, you know, compared to other martial arts.
Yeah. I don't know. But, I mean, see, Marty, I mean, of course I think it's valuable. I spend my life doing it, and I'm going to keep doing it. But there's a lot of people that don't see the value in, like, you know, staying safe and taking care of somebody else. There's a lot of people that would rather just punch somebody that they don't like in the face. That's how much of our country is, I think. And I think
maybe what you're saying is there isn't an example that value can be perceived. Aikido can show you how, or someone how to find another solution. That's just not a concept that is portrayed very much.
And I think I overstated it, because I think there actually are a lot of people that really want to be that centered, compassionate, caring person, but there's not a lot of Aikido dojos that are actually practicing in that way. Many dojos, like Yoshi speaks to this. Yoshi hangs out with like really, really top level martial artists from a whole bunch of different styles. And they all say to him, Yoshi, I love Aikido. I think it's the most amazing art, and I'm so fascinated by it. And then a lot of them say, oh yeah, I went to an Aikido dojo and they just muscled me around and tried to tell me what to do. Like, I'm sorry, we failed. And that's always in the back of my mind. If somebody walks in from the street and they have the experience of a bunch of like strong men pushing them down, we got to work on it because we suck, right? That's that honesty thing. You know, it's like, yeah, I'm stronger than you. I'm going to throw you on the ground. Great. Good for you. You missed the point. So I do think a lot of people actually want that legitimate thing that George is talking about, that Aikido really is amazing at. you just got to be really honest and really good to make it happen.
Great session, Sensei.
Cool.
Really appreciate
Yeah, I could do this
One
longer.
more question.
Okay, Sophie gets one more question, and then you guys can just email him in. Okay, what do you got, Sophie?
So you were kind of saying you see somebody doing something that you're working on and you're like, oh, I got to steal that. Hey, everybody, look at this person. Do you actually call, I don't think I've noticed you kind of like calling out people in terms of like, oh, this person is doing a good job. Everybody look at them.
I could do it more. I've done it sometimes, but actually, like Sophie, that would be a great classroom move in school, where if you can say like, listen to so and so's accent, when they say this sentence, they've really got their schwa, or I don't know, they're really doing something well. The thing is that when you see people who are sort of at a horizontal relationship, when one person does it and then the others can see it, they're like, oh, I can actually do that. When the teacher can do it, it's like, yeah, of course the teacher can do it. So I do it sometimes. I probably could do it more. It really benefits people, especially the
Sensei,
tough stuff.
isn't that sort of like not Japanese? My understanding of
Not
Japanese.
Japanese at all.
Nothing.
Yeah, it's not Japanese at all
You
to do
don't
that.
play
To single somebody out as being better than others or at something.
Yeah, no, it's totally antithetical to traditional Japanese teaching, whereas Yuka points out, you don't praise anybody at all. Like, you just don't get praised. This is a constant conundrum of, there are not many people that really understand Japanese culture and Japanese martial arts culture and American culture, or come from American culture. I think we tend to misread the Japanese a lot, but to be able to try to teach a traditional Japanese martial art in a context that is not traditional Japan, I think it would be, there are people that just get up there and pretend Japanese, and I think it fails a lot of the time, even though it might have some value. And then you have people that get up there and just do it straight. I'm just going to tell you everything and explain everything to death and whatever, very intellectual Western style. I think that fails as well. I think you have to see both and try to make a bridge. That ain't easy.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to cut this off, even though I'm having a lot of fun. Keep those thoughts. We can do more of this maybe next time over beverages or something. I don't know, whatever floats your boat. But I'm glad we did this, Jonathan. Thank you for nudging me into it.
To do this again.
Yeah.
Well, we'll see how long we're
Thank
stuck
you.
online. Yeah.
Thank you.
Super useful. Thank you.
Cool.
Yeah.
Cool. Happy to do it.
Very much.
All right, guys. Enjoy your evenings. I will see you again on Thursday.
Thank you, everybody.
Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Cheers.
Night.
Good night.
Night.